Hi, I'm Amanda Rosewarne. Welcome to this webinar session today. We're delighted to be delivering another thought-provoking and interesting session from the CPD Standards Office. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Kurt Wickart, Chief Bitcoin Historian. That's a great title from CoinGeek. And today we're going to be exploring lots of different areas of blockchain and how it's relevant to our industry across training, education and coaching and many other areas. So Kurt, a huge welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to just kick off with a couple of questions, if that's okay, and try to understand the current landscape with what's happening in the world of blockchain and the differences around these different databases. So I was wondering if you could kind of give us a comprehensive introduction to blockchain,
Sure.
the different databases that are used and basically how the whole thing comes together, because I know that many of our providers will have bumped into it a little bit along the way but not necessarily have moved and understood it that much.
Sure. So let's define a couple of terms first. Blockchain sounds really fancy. It really is just a specific kind of database. So if you work in internet technology or computer technology, a database is just a fancy word for a piece of storage. So you have data and it needs to go somewhere. On your computer, that would typically be your hard drive. But as more and more things move to the cloud and move to distributed computing systems, those databases can be distributed across multiple systems, and they can be multiple redundant copies, or they can be partial copies that are, the term is called sharded. But what it is, it means they are cut up and then they partially overlap, but they're not completely redundant to each other. These are systems like Cassandra or Scylla style databases. And this is how a company like Twitter or Facebook or Google, a kind of company with lots and lots of data needs, would distribute their data out. More traditionally, you can look at like a MySQL database or things like that. If you have a company server, for example, that is serving out, some mission critical kind of information, or if you have even just your company website, for example, is going to be served through a server system, and it'll have its own kind of basic, probably a SQLite database is a common place to serve like mobile web or things like that. So databases are, there's lots of competing technologies. Some of them are patented, some of them are open source. Lots of people use lots of different things for different purposes. Now, blockchain is unique for two reasons. The main thing about a blockchain is that it is distributed in redundancy, which means that there is a complete copy of the database on multiple systems. Secondarily, the data at each block, which I'll explain in a moment, needs to come into consensus. So they need to agree at a certain interval that in Bitcoin, for example, it is a 10-minute interval, that every 10 minutes that the updates to the database all agree with each other. And then once they agree with each other, it writes a block, which is just kind of a techie way of saying, it's kind of like reconciling your books, for example. Like a big company might do this on a monthly or a quarterly basis, and we all certainly do them annually when we pay our taxes. So it's just a 10-minute reconciliation period. And every time you have reconciled a block and everybody agrees, then it moves forward. And it is designed to never go backward. And so that is the unique two aspects of a blockchain, is that, again, redundant and distributed, and forward only. You can never go back and erase something that you had previously put in the database, as long as it was agreed upon. So once it's come to consensus, it's essentially permanent, or it's as permanent as the existence of digital storage and electricity.
I see. Okay. So it does have that difference then, in that it's not something we can go back and erase or change. It's something that once it's been, as you say, agreed and there's a consensus with everybody, it's there in public, so we can verify it, and it's a little bit more trusted than potentially other databases.
Yes, and the reason is that they're also public. So, for example, I can't just arbitrarily go audit the database of a company, for example, or even the bank. So I may have $100,000 in a bank account, but I don't get to ask my bank for an audit just because I'm maybe feeling uncomfortable about the nature of the bank's business.
Mhm.
So the difference here is that the fact that it's publicly auditable means that anybody can check the state of the ledger at any time, meaning,
Right.
are there as many coins in this system as I expect there to be? Or, have my coins been moved, perhaps against my will, which is a really difficult thing to do in the blockchain. But ultimately, it's a tool to not necessarily increase trust, but it increases auditability such that you can trust you can trust anybody that has the technical capability of auditing. And then because it's so widely distributed, it's kind of like you continue to get increasing attestations so that you can trust the validity of the system much more than closed systems, which are the typical way that any sort of data is managed, is typically closed. So that's one of the major perks there.
I see. So that's the reason then why it's been so hugely disruptive, and why so many people have engaged with it, is because there is this transparency and attestation, as you say, that can take place on a continuing basis, because updating every 10 minutes, I mean, that's just incredible. Normally people audit across a year or something. So yeah. It's a very quick turnaround.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the power of it. So it uses cryptography. Well, Bitcoin anyways uses cryptography pretty lightly. But one of the really cool things that Bitcoin does is that every time a block is created, it creates a hash. So the block itself.
I'm going to need to explain this bit to me.
So, a hashing algorithm is kind of like picture a meat grinder. So you take a piece of steak and you put it through a meat grinder, and you will get ground meat out the end. You will always get you have this expectation that ground meat will come out, or I think mincemeat would be more an appropriate phrase for folks on your side of the pond. But so that's the process that we expect to occur out of a specific meat grinder. And that meat grinder might have different attachments for different fineness or coarseness of the meat. And so in computing, we can take the same thing and say that data can be ingested into a machine, and that machine is programmed with a certain algorithm. In the case of Bitcoin, it's SHA-256, but there's a number of different algorithms you can use. And out the other end, you get a predictable output. And that output is a cryptographically secure hash, meaning that it has been converted in a way that if you know both sides of the information, you can reverse engineer whatever you've put in. So this can be the data of the entirety, or the digital data, anyways, of the Library of Congress can be fed in, and it will spit out a very small predictable hash, but also provably unique. It will never be the same twice.
Right.
But it can be as simple as a family photo, or as simple as a digital text file that just simply has your name on it. It will spit out a hash that is roughly the same size as the hash to terabytes or petabytes of data. And so what that does is it allows the cryptography of the system and this computer auditability of all things to make sure that if somebody tries to do a thing, if they try to reverse a block or they try to change something in a previous block, that all of a sudden, all of those computations that created all those hashes they'll either break, or they will give you an alarm and say, hey, somebody has just tried to do something very weird to the database. So there's actually no ability to secretly manipulate the data in the system. And so for people that already have a trust problem with their banks or their money or all kinds of other data systems, a lot of people don't trust social media and the news media and the government and everything else. Everybody's data is bad data unless you can verify it. Bitcoin allows this. Bitcoin allows us to know for sure that the data on your system has not been tampered with. And if it is tampered with, everybody gets an alert. It's not just going to be alerted to some executor of the system or anything like that. It literally goes to everybody. And so it gives us this ability to for the first time, truly know that your data is provably secure and has not been modified. And that's itself, it's extremely disruptive.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's starting to make sense now. So why is blockchain then used for these digital currencies? Why does it make sense to to use this technology against digital currencies? And also, are you able to provide a sort of a bigger definition of what cryptography means? Because I know that that's a term that some of our community members will sort of not necessarily be able to get their heads around that, that clearly.
So cryptography is, I mean, it's a subset of math. So if you understand the basics of math, the most simple cryptographic example is actually called a Caesar cipher. The reason, and this might be a legend, I don't know if this is actually true, but the legend has it that Julius Caesar gave his generals a spinning disk. It was 2 disks, and it had their alphabet and it had a number system. And on Tuesday, you would click it to this number, and on Wednesday, you'd click it to the next, and on Thursday, you'd click it to the next. And that allowed you to just jog the alphabet such that you could give a message that looks like gibberish. But if you have a cipher key and you know what day of the week it is, you can change it and you can decrypt the message.
I see.
So
it goes back a long time.
Yes, the concept is ancient and mechanical. And actually the first entity to bring it into the computer realm is actually the British government. So in World War II, the Nazis had a machine that they called the Enigma machine. It was it was more complex than the Caesar cipher, but it worked on a few of the same principles. And ultimately, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Alan Turing was able to figure out a way to reverse engineer multiple layers of complex cryptography such that he could decrypt and decode the Nazi transmissions of information. And that really kicked off not just the ability for secure and cracking secure communication, but it really jump-started the creation of the computer industry. But by the 1950s and into the 60s, the UK became the center of computer science for many years, and they weren't really upended until the mid 1980s. So Great Britain has a very specifically British. It was an English thing that was a big deal. Like, kudos to the whole of the UK, but they were very much English patriots that made this happen. It's a fascinating piece of history. The reason this is good for money is twofold. The first one is the fact that most people don't understand how central banking works or fiat systems. What a fiat currency is a currency that exists and whose value is attributed to a personality. This is also a Roman invention. So the ancient kings of Rome would say this coin is worth its face value because the face of a king is on it. And so that number was arbitrary. And this is in contrast to something being 1/10 of an ounce of gold, for example, actually has a metal value or a numismatic value. But that's a little bit difficult because what they were doing is people used to cut coins and things like that and say, okay, I don't have a half a pence, so here's a quarter by, whatever. And it just was very destructive, and it was complicated because, well, how do you know it's exactly half and those sorts of things? So fiat currency conceptually solved a lot of those problems of denomination for the sake of making commerce more efficient. But fast forward a few thousand years, and people started to get irritated or continued to be irritated about the fact that, sure, this is effective for many things, but how do I know if there's $1 billion in circulation or $1 trillion in circulation? Because that does impact my purchasing power of my money. And so money has an auditability problem. And this is something a lot of us have been impacted, especially in the Western Hemisphere over the last couple of years. The pandemic created this environment of inflation, and now the cost of eggs is double what it was 3 years ago. And so this is just a simple example of adding a lot of new money to the system, devaluing the purchasing power of the money you already had. And so what Bitcoin specifically solves is this known distribution schedule. We know that Bitcoins are brought into circulation at every single block. So it lets you know exactly how many the system will ever have, how many is in circulation now. And there's no question that what you have in your hand has been devalued by some party, because we all have the ability to audit the system. So that's the one reason why it is really good from like a monetary, like macroeconomic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also an inbuilt incentive system of the network. So you're being asked, will you run a computer that helps us audit the system? And that's a little bit resource intense. That's something that's going to make your electric bill get higher. It's going to make your computer degrade more quickly. It's going to run hot. It's going to make it, you can't play your favorite video game because the computer is focused on doing this one special purpose. Mm-hmm. And so how do you get someone to do that? Some people will do this altruistically. There are altruistic people there, but as soon as your computer breaks down and you have no means to replace it, that feels a little bit like you've been chipped. And so what it does is it acts as a distribution model, but it also acts as like a bootstrapping incentive or a subsidy to encourage you to run one of these systems to help audit the system. And so the currency unit itself is designed to be payment for your labor. So it serves a multiple purpose in and of itself in order to keep the system that it doesn't require some added person or somebody with authority to distribute payment, because then that person becomes the new issuer with the purse strings, and it reintroduces trust and other money problems that Bitcoin was designed to solve in the first place.
I see. Okay, so it really is working on that sort of transparency point of view, and as you say, giving somebody back an incentive for their time. So we hear about a lot of notorious cases and infamous situations surrounding blockchain, surrounding cryptocurrencies. What is the most notorious currently at the moment? What's the dark underbelly of all of this? As we sit here now, we've got this one side that's really positive, and you can see the reasons for the way the systems are running. But where's the dark side? Tell us a bit more about that, Kurt.
So there's a few. One of them is the way that exchanges are distributed. Because it's a global money, it's not under control of anyone necessarily, or at least there's debate as to who has jurisdiction on punishment and those kind of things. Obviously, if I commit a financial crime in the US, I'll be arrested and prosecuted in the US. But there are interesting mitigations that, perhaps I can open an entity that is in Singapore, and then that can own an entity that is in Malta. And then my Maltese entity can form an exchange whose practices are really opaque. And maybe we build a good reputation and say, hey, yeah, if you want to exchange Bitcoin for Ethereum, or Ethereum for dollars, or your tokenized dollars for British pounds or euros or anything else, we'll facilitate that trade for you. And that seems, in a basic sense, like a good business model, but it inserts the opportunity, given the decentralized nature of the base currencies, to become a pretty serious money laundering operation. And if you're in a place whose financial regulations are minimal, in some ways that's a good thing, but in other ways it will also invite or entice seedy reputation types to go do such a thing. And they start to become, I believe the term is a bucket shop for criminals to pretend to be doing real business, but actually, here, take my crime coins. Can I withdraw some clean money? That kind of thing. And then people like you and me, just, hey, can I buy a Bitcoin here? And yeah, we'd love to sell you a Bitcoin, but remember, the history of that Bitcoin is on a permanent ledger. And now maybe I'm holding a Bitcoin that the previous transaction was for some major global crime, and Interpol is going to at some point knock on my door and ask why I'm the guy with that coin. And so obviously I have some proof that, oh, well, I bought it from this exchange and all of that, but it also brings in a lot of opportunity for me to be in trouble. But in the meantime, they're facilitating lots of, in some cases, heinous crimes. And so that's one problem. The second problem might actually be worse, and I've theorized that it could even be something of a psyop in order to undermine the concept of blockchain technology in the first place, because it's such an easy thing to do. So what I've described in creating a blockchain asset or cryptocurrency, someone like myself, I could spin up a new coin in 10 minutes. I can rent some space on Amazon web server. I can simulate all these things. I can create multiple distributed computers. I can issue a certain amount of coins. And if I'm really good at marketing and really good at social engineering, and I understand market psychology, and I pay for a couple of influencers and some things very trivially with maybe $100,000 or less, I can create literally billions of dollars in value printed out of nowhere. And that's been observed now hundreds or thousands of times in the blockchain economy by people who say, "Hey, this is going to be the new thing. We're doing this stuff. We have partnerships with FIFA or with just picking big brands and making people think, oh my goodness, this is a huge opportunity." And by the time FIFA would even send a lawsuit out, you've already taken all the money you're going to take, and you have disbanded and changed your name and all these other things because you made so much money so fast and so dishonestly that regular systems really struggle to keep up.
Wasn't there the incident with OneCoin?
Yes,
organization that set up OneCoin? Is that I'm not sure that everybody tuning in will know the background of it, but is that an example of a kind of fake crypto?
That is actually the best example. In fact, I think OneCoin stole like tens of billions of dollars. It was some absurd number. And I don't think the blockchain ever even launched. They were so clever and so good at their marketing that they realized they never even had to do the technical stuff to trick people into sending their money. So they just
created an illusion of a new currency. So it's like maybe you saying, I'm creating Kurtcoin, and here's the marketing, and this is all the advertising, and these are the partnerships I've got. Here's the web address, send your money in and it'll be invested, etc., etc. And then actually that doesn't happen underneath.
Precisely. It's a pretty classic confidence scheme or a Ponzi scheme. Now there's a third version of this that is, in my opinion, the very worst. It's even worse.
Okay.
So we've seen the collapse of Celsius, Voyager, BlockFi, FTX, and there's one or two other ones just over the last 12 months.
And these are cryptocurrencies, right?
These are cryptocurrency exchanges.
Okay.
And so what they've done is they have created huge branding opportunities for themselves. FTX is now the biggest cryptocurrency business collapse in the history of the blockchain economy. It's been valued between 30 and 40 billion dollars. The reason they're not really sure about that 10 billion in the middle is because where did it all go? And so what they did is they started offering lending products. So say, hey, if you use us like a bank, if you keep your Bitcoin here or your Ethereum here, we will issue you a token that says we owe you a certain amount back, and we'll give you some crazy amount of interest. I've seen anywhere from 10 to 20% interest rates, which is obviously a lot better than you can get with a savings account. And so it's enticing.
Yeah.
Well, what they're doing is the same thing. They're printing a coin out of nowhere. They're marketing that coin. They're trying to gin up liquidity and capital by speculation on that coin. And they're really just using deposits to pay people out. So it's a classic Ponzi scheme in many ways, but also with this notion of printing their own money out of nowhere attached to it. But in the case of FTX actually bought the basketball stadium in Miami. So it was the FTX Arena where the Miami Heat play. Then they brought in celebrity, like major celebrity endorsement. They had Super Bowl ads last year and all kinds of things. So by all means, they seemed very, very, very legitimate. The CEO of FTX was on the cover of Forbes. There were people calling him the next what's his name? The Berkshire Hathaway CEO.
Wow. And so it's really powerful then, really strong reputation.
very, very, very powerful reputation. And it was all fake. He printed all of it out of nowhere. And the problem here is that in this situation, it was so ubiquitous that it was very common for someone in your family to have had $10,000 at FTX because they were earning interest. They felt like, oh my gosh, I'm finally getting ahead. This blockchain stuff, this cryptocurrency stuff is going to change the world. And then they lose everything. And then Sam has now been arrested. He's in, sitting in jail somewhere in New York, awaiting, further, all this other stuff. And so the reason why I said about 10 minutes ago that I feel like this could be a psyop against the truly disruptive technology is that it's so easy to create that. And then you destroy the reputation of all of the good stuff that can be done.
Across the industry.
So it's very, very unfortunate. Whether Sam from FTX is just a completely, he's just a crook and acted alone, fine, but it's still, it gave all of us a big scar on our reputation, and it's really unfortunate.
And do you think there's a recovery element from that, or do you think that there will be every now and again some of these exchanges collapsing because there is a sort of a crooked persona behind it, that everywhere there's money there's theft, right? So in any country, in any currency. So do you think we'll always see this notorious use, or do you think it will slowly start to almost like regulate itself as a system?
This is the power of having everything on a single network. I'm a big believer that we really only ever needed one blockchain. And if everybody's using that same system, then it is auditable. The way that these crimes are perpetrated is in the exchange of one coin for another, is happening in a dark room, or the creation of a new coin in order to create fake liquidity. Like that's another thing that shouldn't be occurring, because everything should be done on a single network. And if that's done, we actually do get a more trustworthy economy overall. But since we're in that infancy phase, there's so much opportunity for the criminal element to say, hey, if I can make myself a few $1,000,000 this year by being fake, I don't even have to use my real identity. My risk of actual trouble is so minimal. Why would I not just do such a thing? And and there is it's kind of like you're cutting off the value of your own potential in the future too. But most people aren't thinking in a macro sense or thinking about who does this harm globally. It's not one of those things that people are thinking about really deeply when they see such a juicy opportunity. So, but to the flip side, I mean, we had another gigantic bank failure here in the U.S. Over the last week, and we've had several very big failures in the last 4 or 5 months here. But I mean,
that's dropped the traditional banking system itself, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
In the UK here, the Silicon Valley Bank has sent massive shockwaves through the markets. No, and it's one of those things where, well, banks have been around for several hundred years, that we need them, and then it starts to beg the question, well, do we need them and whatever else? But it's so much easier to say we don't need this disruptive new technology. It's only been here for 10 years or something. And so it's easy to write it off and say, okay, the last thing we need is one more very weird, risky financial instrument. And so I don't know, but it's going to take a lot of maturity to solve both problems, frankly, both traditional banking and some of this blockchain malfeasance. Yeah, I can see that. So what are the present issues then? We've got the notorious sort of dark underbelly. Are these all the things that can go wrong, and how we can be hoodwinked, etc.? But what are the sort of more practical and current issues that are at play at the moment? I mean, has the pandemic had a big effect? Has inflation affected how these currencies work? What's sort of bubbling around? What are the big conversations that are happening?
I think so. There's always really been two camps in the blockchain space, and it's the utility camp, the people that want to build disruptive businesses and raise money for their startup, versus the people that think of it primarily as a financial asset or an investment vehicle.
Yeah.
And those two groups have always been very much at odds. Now, the investment people will say, well, just by doing nothing but holding Bitcoin, it's the most performant asset in the known history of the world. So why would I stop now? And they have a point. If you had done nothing but bought Bitcoin over the last 10 years, you're up many tens of thousands of percent in your portfolio valuation. But it also created the ripe field of opportunity for these crimes and some of these other things that I've mentioned, that if it's just a speculative financial asset, then it's never really going to come all the way out of the shadows. It will always sort of stay a gray market asset. But if it ends up disrupting real payments, and there are very simple ways this could be done. Companies like MoneyGram or Western Union, for example, are 100-plus-year-old businesses. They have very archaic systems, but they just don't have a practical competitor, and so they just remain.
Yeah.
Well, those two businesses could very trivially be disrupted by Bitcoin's existence, but that's if you're willing to use Bitcoin as essentially a settlement rail or a remittance rail. But people look at the opportunity cost of it and say, well, if I had sold my Bitcoin or I had used my Bitcoin for settlement, I would have less money today than having done nothing and just held my Bitcoin. And so the present issue is basically the cultural balance of opportunity cost versus investment cost. And so at some point, I'm of the opinion that at some point it must become an asset that is used primarily in business, or this bubble investment thing. It must burst at some point. It can only absorb so much value based on popularity or collectability or the promise of some future fintech revolution. And so and that may have already burst. That we may have seen the top 2 years ago when Bitcoin BTC was almost $70,000 a coin. But I could be wrong. I mean, the market cycle could take 20 more years. It might end up being $1 million a coin before people say, okay, the upward volatility is probably slowed down enough for me to think about redeploying it into other economic ventures. And so so I think it's a little bit of a cultural thing is one of the major issues. And then secondarily is scalability. So the response to should we use Bitcoin for business then begs the question, can it be used for business? And
I was just thinking that, if you've got a group of businesses in the market and somehow got an agreement, a cartel of organizations, let's just trade in Bitcoin. How are we going to make that shift? How's that going to happen?
So
involve a lot of trust, right? And a lot of
it is. Well, it takes a lot of education. It takes a lot of external macro incentives. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called The Tipping Point about 20 years ago.
Oh, yes. I read that a long time back.
He explains like how an idea goes from an idea to being a viral part of our lives. And he says ideas spread like pandemics, essentially, or epidemics, I think was the word he used. And so it's that stickiness factor. Bitcoin does have that. It has the mind. Everybody knows the word Bitcoin, so that's become ubiquitous. That part of it is viral. But the stickiness of thinking, okay, should I do my settlements in Bitcoin versus doing my settlements in dollars? Well, globally, for example, the entire global oil trade is settled in dollars. Well, the BRICS nations have been talking about, this is Russia, China, South Africa, Brazil. I'm missing one. India, thank you. Saying, hey, should we perhaps issue a new currency or just use one of our, should we settle in rubles or yuan or whatever else? And it's interesting. It's a curiosity because we've gone roughly 100 years or so of the dollar being the primary asset, and we've gone nearly 60 years of it being the sole asset for
pegged to oil. Yeah,
it's exactly. And so we don't know the implications of it. The economy has changed so much, but we've continued to use the dollar for settlement for so long that there's nobody alive who experienced it in another epoch. So it's one of those things where now you can bring in a bunch of macroeconomic theorists to say, again, can we? And if we can, should we? And what are the potential consequences for it? But if that's going to happen, if we're going to see a major disruption of the dollar, I mean, that's going to be a major disruption of Western hegemony in general. And then it might make sense for Bitcoin to be that thing that makes everybody feel like, hey, maybe I'm not conceding something to my enemy. Maybe we're all conceding to something that is neutral. As an American, I don't necessarily want to see the Chinese money or the Russian money be the global reserve currency. That causes me socioeconomic and political problems. But if we can all kind of come to the table and say, what if we all do Bitcoin? Like, I didn't create it, you didn't create it, none of us control it, and all these other things. That might
we all
be
know about it, as you say. The idea has become ubiquitous.
Yeah, so it might be a way to sort of soften the cultural and political aspects of some of those things, but it also introduces its own problems. Like I said, because of scalability, how many payments can be settled globally in Bitcoin in an hour or a day? And that's actually, it's a really political problem in the Bitcoin space too. So among Bitcoiners, there's an argument that, well, it should only be infrequent and expensive payments to incentivize an extremely robust security of the network. That's not the camp that I'm in. I'm of the camp that I believe that we should have predictable low fees to encourage people to be able to do their own business without having to use clearing houses or things that are above them. Like for me, like I might pay a $5 fee for a transaction, but that censors out 4 billion people on earth who are living on $5 a week. And so, So I'm of the opinion that sub-cent fees need to be the norm, and that people need to stop thinking conceptually about, I need to go to my bank or go to Western Union to send money around, that you can actually just do it directly from your own device and audit your own work and do that. But that's a very political discussion in the blockchain space, whether the trade-offs on scalability versus security are worth whatever that risk is.
And I think, as you say, the political arena at the moment, the geopolitical arena at the moment is volatile, polarized in many countries. We're seeing a level of geopolitics that we've probably never witnessed before. And as I mentioned earlier, you put the pandemic into that, and that's sort of supercharged all sorts of other cultural and economic changes. It's a really fascinating area. So just then sort of reflecting on all of those and making some predictions for the future, what with Web 0.30, what are your expectations for the future? What do you think we'll see? Do you think we'll see some of this come alive?
I do. I certainly hope we do anyways, because, imagine a world where there's another 4 billion people that can participate in the global economy that right now are censored from it. And not even censored by anybody's malice, but they're censored simply by access to technology and access to capital and access to the ability to even communicate with the Western economic world, or what we might call the first world. And the selfish part of that for me, I look at it and say, that might be the most brilliant people in the world might be part of that section of the world that we don't get the opportunity to connect with today. And I want to benefit from the entrepreneurship that can't connect to the world currently. And so I think there's a little bit of a moral obligation. And I think there's also that sort of selfish economic aspect to it too, where, hey, I just want more economic participants to create more cool things. But secondarily, with this ability to audit the money and audit whatever other data there is in on a global ledger, that also gives me a bunch of opportunity to sort of take my digital identity back. In many ways, it's been stolen. by people that we don't even understand how they do it. Like, we know that companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter take our data and they repurpose it for their own profit. A company like Twitter, for example, 99% of the money that Twitter makes is by selling your data. And you don't benefit from it.
When you think about it. Yeah, you have no control. But
yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it, though, because we have willingly given away, and certainly I think the trends, the younger generation have willingly traded their personal data for use of the technology.
Yeah.
And then, are incensed that by using that technology and giving their personal data, that's, change the algorithms that, talk to them and shape their online digital world. I mean, I personally find this area, fascinating. But
well, your digital data is the most valuable commodity in the world, and it is being traded completely to your detriment. And so, it's the ability to take that sovereignty back and to perhaps log into something like Twitter using your cryptographic keys with your Bitcoin wallet, for example. And maybe you pay to post and people pay you to interact and you sell your data. The problem with your data is that the average person's data isn't worth a lot of money. And so there's not a practical way to pay them for it, actually. And so, but what if every single time the Google Ads API used your data for something, that you received whatever its fair market value was in a direct payment? Maybe it's less than a penny, but it is worth something. And so in the paradigm of today, it would need to be aggregated over a long period of time or aggregated with other people's data, and then you'd be paid out on some interval. But if you could be paid a fraction of a penny every time your data is used and paid directly, that then makes you have an economic relationship with these data mining companies. And so that's another very practical thing that a very scalable blockchain. This is why I like scalable blockchains, is that with that, you can take back that data sovereignty that we don't even know is missing if you're born into it. But then also the tokenization of all kinds of other assets. Like, you can tokenize your own home, for example, rather than taking a reverse mortgage, which is something a lot of people do around retirement age. They want to stay in their home, and most of the equity has been paid in, but they want money to live. Well, what if instead of doing a reverse mortgage on your home, you actually tokenized your house into shares? So if you split your house into 100 shares, and you could sell 10 shares of your home to somebody else in exchange for redemption whenever that house is sold in the future, maybe upon your death or something like that. That's a pretty impractical thing to do today because of technological limitations. But with the blockchain, you could tokenize your home assets, program them with a smart contract. They can put all the contract language into what's essentially an app. And it's automatically distributed whenever the terms of the contract are fulfilled. And so it allows people to...
It's a really interesting idea, isn't it? Like, hey, I'll retire and I will sell 20% of my house with a bottom line reverse mechanism cutting in at 10% or something. Yeah,
exactly.
Really interesting.
Yeah. So we start to give normal people access to complex financial instruments that would only be allowed to banks or other institutions today. And they can be done in a way that is simplified, that the average person can understand them and deploy them, and they don't need to ask permission or have a legal degree. And so there's lots and lots of things like that. Another one, and this is a business idea I've had, I pitch it at everybody. So if somebody hears this and turns it into a company, please contact me, give me a piece of equity. But I've talked about tokenizing vehicles. So what if your car was turned into a token? So it had a digital twin that lived on the blockchain. And every time you went for your basic service intervals, so this would be 3,000 miles, you get your oil changed, for example. Well, a lot of people do it late. Maybe they do it at 5,000 miles very consistently. And that has a estimated added wear and tear to the integrity of your vehicle over time, which lowers its value. But that data isn't necessarily immediately available. So maybe you were good at keeping your car clean, but you weren't good at keeping it mechanically maintained. So the car can appear to be a certain value, but it's actually worth a little bit less. Now, if your car had a digital twin and every time somebody went and got that oil changed and consistently kept up with all their fluids and rotating their tires and all the other things that you want to do to a car to keep it well done, that gives you, especially in aggregate, it gives you a global spot price for that vehicle at a given time. And you can prove, hey, you know what? This car was maintained a lot better than this other car that appears to be identical in a cosmetic sense. And so this car is maybe worth 3 or 4% more, and it's provable. Nobody can change that data. Nobody can tamper with it in any way. And so it allows people to make more useful economic decisions about the purchase of a used car. And then you can transfer that concept. The car concept can be transferred to any asset and do a similar thing to allow people to more easily value anything based on how well it was maintained or what its actual provenance of maintenance or ownership or whatever the value comes from. If you can track that value, it becomes more valuable.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you think that will become reality? Do you think we can get to that point?
The technology exists. It's 100% there. It's ready to go. We just need entrepreneurs that build a business model that implements it.
And for it to become a normality as well, for us to feel trusted in these systems.
That takes time.
Yeah, it is going to take a huge amount of time. But I like the point you make about, going back to oil and oil being pegged to the dollar. That was a new move for a few generations of people. As you say, they're not around anymore, but that revolutionized. And now we're in that as a normality. But oil isn't necessarily going to be traded in the same way in the future with all of these new electric technologies. So who knows? Wow, thank you so much. It's been a really, really interesting session and some really great insights there. Are there any kind of concluding comments that you'd like to make or share with us? You've got so much wisdom in this area.
I think the business of Bitcoin is business. And I'm very happy for all the people that have made a lot of money by doing nothing. I have benefited from this myself. But ultimately, changing the world, reducing economic friction, and increasing the integrity of data is not only noble, and it's extremely noble, but it's also going to be a very profitable business. The richest entrepreneur in the world in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years will be someone who has solved the major problems of data integrity and economic efficiency. And it could be somebody watching this webinar, and truly I hope it is, but it needs to be someone. And if nobody does it, then the investment aspect of it and all this frothiness, it'll all have been for nothing. And then we will have to be poorer in a world that never benefited from this technology. And so I'm going to end with a challenge and let everybody watching know that you could be that entrepreneur that they write history books about, because the tools are there. We just need somebody to take the risk and do the work.
What a great note to end on. Thank you, Kurt. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.